moving on to searching, and what this is primarily going to do is give you a framework for thinking about searching. And the references that you see in brackets here refer you to the Cochrane Handbook. We have a chapter that's co-authored by all of us on qualitative research, and it has a section on searching. So it's true to say, and this is really testimony to other colleagues within Cochrane, Carol Lefebvre and others, that we had a lot of catching up to do with regard to qualitative research to get it anywhere near the stages that are now there for Cochrane effectiveness reviews. And so, for example, there hasn't been a retrospective attempt to identify qualitative research in the same way as the Cochrane has gone through clinical trials and indexed those. But added to that, there are particular challenges about looking for qualitative research. Non-informative titles. You might have "How Green Was My Valley," a study of urban regeneration or something like that. It doesn't make it clear that it's qualitative research. As a group, we're very much in favour of using a semicolon with qualitative study or qualitative evidence synthesis after studies to make them more retrievable. The terminology is diffuse. If you look at one of the longer versions of filter, you can see how many different ways there might be to getting relevant material. Some might relate to the perspectives of people, others might relate to the study type or the phenomenon, some even to the methods of data and collection and analysis. The indexing is generally poor. It was only relatively recently, and by this I mean sort of early last decade, that the word qualitative research became an index term in Medline, for example. Before that, it was nursing methodology research. And obviously, you're looking for the qualitative needle in a quantitative haystack, where you've got millions of records, say on Medline, of which a small proportion, perhaps 1% or 5%, relates to qualitative or mixed methods. So in order to make sense of these challenges, we have proposed a 7S framework. We've already dealt with structured questions, which we've put first for the purposes of this presentation. But the things you need to think about are sampling, sources, search procedures, strategies and filters, supplementary strategies, and standards for reporting. But taking a step back and realizing that these search strategies are not just cranking the handle on a black box, but they have to be aligned to your purpose. One of the first things that you have to ask is, am I going to be constructing a qualitative review that is very much like a qualitative equivalent of a Cochrane review? So will it be aggregative? Will I be trying to find every single study? Or will it be sufficient for me to construct an overall interpretation of the phenomenon? So in which case I might be interested in sampling. And there, of course, aggregative works around finding more of the same, whereas interpretive means deliberately searching for additional insights and perspectives. A second consideration is theory expected to play an important part in the review? So do you need to be able to make links to mid-range theories, such as the theory of planned behavior, for example? And the third is, are differences in context important to understanding the phenomenon? And this very much relates to the setting that you have. So you can imagine that the control of the context that takes place in a operating theatre, for example, across multiple countries is much closer to a shared context than, for example, smoking cessation across numerous different public health systems. So if the environment is controlled, then the contextual differences are less likely to be important. They will be important, of course, because they're made up of different humans with different backgrounds, but certainly the environment has a shape. So I thought it was helpful just to give you an overview before we go into the detail here. Here are the 7 components, and this is a traffic light system to say where they're similar or different to the effectiveness considerations when you're searching. So as we've seen, structured questions there in the amber, that PICO and SPICE are very similar to the PICO equivalent. When it comes to sources, strategies and filters, supplementary strategies and standards for reporting, there are great similarities, but also slight differences. And search procedures, we haven't, as far as I know, invented any search procedures specific to qualitative. More typically, anything new is designed to apply equally to quantitative and qualitative. So in terms of priorities to finding out about things, you could say that the biggest change to the mindset, if you like, relates to sampling. And just to say, it's very difficult to keep in touch with on top of the literature, and so as part of the Health Technology Assessment International initiative, there is a chapter that reviews and updates on a 6-monthly basis the research that comes out about searching for qualitative research alongside other types, and this is maintained by myself and a couple of colleagues. It's the qualitative chapter within Sure Info, and there's a link at the top of the slides. So looking first of all at sampling, so it's a key decision about whether we're going to mirror systematic reviews of effectiveness by using comprehensive and exhaustive approaches, or whether we're going to mirror primary qualitative research by using purposive sampling. And purposive sampling is for those circumstances where you're trying to get an overall interpretation. So, for example, you might be specifically looking for papers that come up with a variation, or particularly rich papers that give you a really rich understanding of the phenomenon. There's plenty more on sampling in the bibliography. And I would point to you to 2 empirical papers there by Ames and Karen Hannes and colleagues, where they've actually tried purposive sampling in a qualitative synthesis. Excuse me. So moving swiftly on to sources. Here, the big change, of course, is that book chapters and theses are likely to be much more important than they would be, say, for randomized controlled trials. But another interesting phenomenon is that figures have shown that you can reach a high percentage of your included studies with a small number of databases. There is an element here of being self-fulfilling, because obviously this is only based on what people have done rather than what they should do. But nevertheless, we can see that you can put an awful lot of effort into covering multiple databases for little extra return. So this doesn't mean, oh, I can get away with just searching a few databases. It means if I want to get away with searching the fewest number databases required, then I have to construct a very good strategy on those databases. And my time is therefore better spent constructing that excellent search strategy across those databases than just going on to endless variety of databases. However, the consideration of sampling does actually come in as well. You may be sampling databases that are quite different from your core databases. So here's, for example, a sort of profile that you might have. You might search some core health databases, some generic subject databases, some databases specific to the topic. And bear in mind that although this is phrased in terms of discipline, that you've also got the next consideration that you might also choose databases according to the region or context you're searching. And the important point is that you're sampling for diversity, not homogeneity. By that we mean you don't go for more of the same as you get from adding Embase to Medline and possibly adding PsycInfo to Medline and Embase. You specifically look for databases that are going to give you different perspectives so that you can round out your interpretation. And of course, you can't do a randomized controlled trial very easily in a thesis, but you can do qualitative research, do good qualitative research within a thesis or a book chapter. So you're looking at these alternative sources. And grey literature, or as our American cousins put it, fugitive literature, which is a lot more exciting, sounds like Harrison Ford, becomes particularly important. And just personally, I use a tool called Publish or Perish, which is a desktop tool for searching across Google Scholar in a systematic way. Just a point there, sorry, just going back. It's unhelpful to talk about grey literature as if it's a single standard category. It's better to think of the types of evidence that you're going to find, such as thesis, rather than labeling it all as grey literature. In terms of search procedures, there are procedures that have been developed to meet the particular needs of qualitative research, but they're also of benefit for those of you searching in quantitative areas. So the cluster method is helpful in finding what we call sibling reports, and Jane has done a study on trying to find associated reports. So here you're not looking at an individual paper as being the thing you're looking for a group of related reports so that you can broaden your understanding of context. And the other approach is to search for theory. And here we have a string of terms that we've investigated that can be used to find examples of theory called the behemoth approach. Strategies and filters. So for those of you not familiar, a filter is a standardized search strategy that you add at the end of your search so that you maximize your chance of finding qualitative articles. The filters that have been developed in the qualitative field don't work as perfectly as those in quantitative, but there's some evidence to suggest that some of the terms appear very commonly, making less familiar terms less useful when searching. And so the sort of terms that you might be looking for that would help you identify qualitative research are contained in this acronym ESCAPADE. There may be terms to do with the methods, there may be terms to do with the application or the approaches used, or indeed to do with the sort of data you're after or the experiences. So these terms will then tend to be evaluated, and their usefulness will be seen for a filter. So a filter might look like this. This is the shortest possible filter. Developed initially by Maria Grant. You can see that it's looking for phrases and words beginning with qualitative, for the term findings, because that's more likely to be in qualitative papers, results being in quantitative, and the aspect of interview, either as a free text term or as a subject term. Kate, my colleague who's online today, has evaluated these in a case study and found initial evidence to suggest that it may well be that a simple search strategy may be as effective in identifying qualitative research because the common term will appear along with perhaps less common ones as well. So what you're just doing is adding additional less common terms, but you're not increasing the number of records that you find. But the important caution is that this may be topic specific, so we need to explore this even further. And those of you who want to select the best choice filter for your particular study, there is another resource, again, one that I contribute with other colleagues that relates to evaluating the different filters that are available, giving you the reference and some observation on when to use it. So towards the end of our 7S strategy, supplementary strategies, we find that because of the poor indexing of qualitative studies mentioned earlier, that features like citation searching or indeed related articles become particularly useful. Now, these become really difficult to report, but they're worth doing because of their yield. And this is a study I did with Chris Cooper and colleagues down in Exeter that actually found additional good quality studies from using these techniques that actually changed the overall interpretation of the synthesis. Just a brief mention that if you look in the handbook, the Cochrane handbook, section 21.7.1, that when you're particularly interested in implementation, so qualitative research for implementation, you find process evaluations are really important. And so we've got some initial information to share with you on how to find process evaluations with some suggested terms. An important issue is, when can I stop searching? We often get asked this, particularly if you're going to move away from comprehensive searching, where you stop when you reach the end of your database list, to more purposive searching. It's a bit like the questions of how many interviews is enough for primary qualitative research. You could try and identify a point of theoretical saturation, which is one of these I'll know it when I see it sort of things that qualitative researchers try and bamboozle you with. You could go for something suggested at one of our workshops, bibliographic sufficiency, when the same references keep coming up. But that might just be a sign that you need to move on to another patch or database, rather than that you should stop completely. So you need to make sure that you've got enough diversity in the perspectives, say, for example, of ethnic minorities, or of genders, or of socioeconomic groups. But probably more practically, it's when you have no more questions to answer. And then finally, we do recognize the importance of reporting your search methods. And the 7S was an attempt to prompt people to make sure that they cover these elements. In the Cochrane guidance, we mention the deficiencies in reporting. We mention a suggested framework called Starlight, which includes the sampling strategy. So that's the difference from quantitative searching. But subsequent to that, Prisma S has come out for specifically for searching. We believe that this applies equally to qualitative syntheses. The only thing we would say is that there's no recognition of the importance of sampling. So you would need to mention your sampling approach, as in the Starlight example. NTREC, which is the generic standards for reporting, has 4 items that you report. So Starlight and Prisma S certainly give you more details on what you should include than the generic approaches like NTREC or Emerge. So in summary then, the 7S framework: justify your sampling strategy, match it to your synthesis. In health topics, start with Medline and CINAHL, and then look at the additional contributions of topic-specific and setting-specific sources. Use structured questions, as we came in on. Try and privilege specificity, because there are more quantitative studies and you're trying to find the needle in the haystack. Your filters should match your intended purpose of the review, so don't just use the same filter over and over again. Use the supplementary techniques such as citation searching, relevant article, related article searching, and use Prisma P and Starlight, as well as a generic reporting standard like NTREC. And this is what we call the triptych, the 3 areas where you can find more details on searching for qualitative research. Just by way of a bridge between this session and the next session, we're just going to ask you, while you think of questions you might want to ask, to just complete the quick poll on sampling, which will be the beginning of the next session, but is very much related to searching in this example here. But as you can see, 65% recognize that you need to think about your review purpose, and a further 23% of you are more familiar with one approach and might well benefit from having a look at the alternative. Okay, thank you everyone on that. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much. And while I'm just about to pick up a question, Amanda Mason-Jones asked, can you show the triptych slide again, please? So
yeah, okay.
While you scroll through your slides. So thanks very much to everybody who's put in questions. Lots of them we've picked up and managed through the chat box and put links into papers, particularly around theory and about the use of generic term qualitative research. Claire Kelly raises a question which I think many people kind of sort of have a bit of conundrum over. So she's doing a systematic review where the phenomenon of interest is attitudes or opinion data, and she's including survey data and qualitative data. So she says, for the purposes of searching the literature, can I consider this as qualitative evidence synthesis, or will it risk missing the survey evidence? So Jane picked up on this, saying you can do a mixed studies or mixed methods to review to incorporate the quant from surveys and the qual from qualitative, or do qualitative evidence synthesis on any qual data from open-ended questions. To which Claire then said, so I wonder if survey and qualitative studies would both be identified by the searching methods you discussed here, or whether she'd need to take a different approach. So I think kind of the outcome of it, so it's a question that we often get asked about, can you include survey data? And I think our most common answer is the one that Jane used, which is around you can use the data from open-ended questions in the surveys. But this question about whether survey and qualitative studies would be identified by searching methods you've discussed here is the one that kind of remains unanswered.
Yeah, no, I think this is really good question, and I suppose there's a priority here for how you search for surveys. My perception is that most of the filters for qualitative research specifically wouldn't pick up surveys automatically, because a survey wouldn't be labeled, for example, of mixed method, and they might not say that they're collecting qualitative data. And indeed, some of the things that you've just mentioned, like open-ended questions, wouldn't necessarily be part of a qualitative filter either. So I think if you are going to specifically look for surveys, then probably the most rigorous thing to do would be to work with an information professional to develop a specific filter looking for surveys using terms like survey and open-ended questions. Jane is absolutely right. If resources isn't an issue and you're actually going to do mixed methods, and it's a question of lumping the surveys together with the qualitative, then a mixed method approach would be fine. But I'm not even sure a mixed method strategy, as opposed to you see, the problem is that quantitative strategies are typically designed not to pick up surveys, and qualitative don't explicitly pick up surveys. So I suggest that you probably have to think of terms that will specifically identify surveys. And then, as you say, Kate, the issue then becomes, how am I going to use the surveys? Is it real proper qualitative data? And we tend to use surveys to corroborate rather than to generate ideas or theories or themes.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Andrew. And Jan's just made a good point that some qualitative researchers don't consider responses to open-ended survey questions as qualitative data. So
yeah, that reinforces my advice, doesn't it? Yes, that it wouldn't be labelled as qualitative. Yeah.
Thank you. And Faith Bozo has asked if you could go through the traffic colour system attached to the 7 S's, and others had picked up on that as well, which was slide 28, Andrew.
Okay, so what we're saying is the main difference between quantitative and qualitative searching is this issue of sampling. And if you're going to do a comprehensive systematic review, so you're aiming to include all the qualitative research, then it looks very similar to the template for an effectiveness review. However, if you're going to sample purposively, then this is a really important consideration that will, if you like, govern the rest of the search process. So that's why it was flagged with a red. The search procedures, because the databases work in the same way, that was the only one with the green, because you can't do anything new with the database. Everything else was in yellow, and I probably should flick back. Everything else was in yellow because they are similar enough for you to recognize the connection between what you're trying to do qualitatively and quantitatively, but they're not similar. For example, there are different filters, there are different sources. So here we have it here. Sampling is the most different, search procedures is the least different, and for the rest you just need to be aware that although it may bear similarities to what you're used to, that there are some specific considerations, and that's what I've highlighted in the subsequent slides.
That's great. Thanks very much, Andrew. So there's the question running through the chat now about the use of surveys as qualitative data. Always
We have to do a survey on it. I do a poll on it.
Absolutely. And one final question, I think, before we get to wrap up. Lawrence Blanchard's just asked, regarding sampling, I imagine that the search could still be quite broad or comprehensive, but the sampling is actioned at the screening stage. Or do you see this as a different procedure?
This is really good point. I would refer you to our next lecture here on selecting studies on the 13th of December. Just to say that at this very moment, and in this case, it's Jane and I and a colleague, Heather Ames, who I referred to in Norway, we're actually working on the chapter on sampling for the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementation Methods Group Handbook, which we hope will appear in a year's time. Now, I know that won't help with your particular question here, although I'm very happy to share slides. Well, the slides actually will be part of the next presentation. But just to say, yes, if you're going to sample purposively, then you still want to construct a sampling frame. And so the point that has just been made, at the very beginning, it may well be that your objectives from your search strategy are very similar. So in one case, to identify all the studies, and in the other case, to identify particularly the distribution of the studies and the perspectives that they capture. So up to that point, it looks very similar. From that point onwards, then the purposively sampling looks very different. But yes, your objective is still, if you're an information specialist, it would be either to hand over all the references for screening, or to hand over the references for some form of mapping before selecting your method of sampling. So yes, up to that point, it looks very similar indeed. A great point.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And thanks very much. I think Naomi Ferns is putting in some, what looks to be some very helpful references, so thank you.